the hunt for the ghost, the assassin no government could find. At 3 in the morning on August 14, 1994, a group of men crept into a quiet apartment in Khartoum, Sudan, and pinned a sleeping man to his bed. He woke up handcuffed with no idea, at first, who had finally caught him. For 20 years, he had been one of the most hunted human beings on the planet. Intelligence agencies across multiple continents had chased him. Police forces had lost him in gun battles. Entire countries had quietly sheltered him rather than hand him over. He had walked openly through Beirut, Damascus, Budapest, and Tripoli, protected by governments that found him useful. He had planned attacks that killed dozens of people and taken hostages by the dozen in a single afternoon. And for 2 decades, no government on Earth had actually been able to put him in handcuffs. His name, most of the world knew him by, wasn't even real. He was born Ilich Ramirez Sanchez. The world called him Carlos the Jackal. This is the story of how one of history's most protected fugitives finally ran out of governments willing to hide him. Chapter 1. The making of a terrorist. Ilich Ramirez Sanchez was born in Caracas, Venezuela in 1949, the son of a committed Marxist lawyer who named his 3 sons Ilich, Vladimir, and Lenin, an unmistakable tribute to a Russian revolutionary his father deeply admired. His upbringing was steeped in radical politics from the very beginning. In 1968, his father arranged for him to study at Patrice Lumumba University in Moscow, an institution well known at the time for cultivating foreign communists sympathetic to the Soviet cause. He was expelled 2 years later. From Moscow, Ramirez Sanchez traveled to Beirut and volunteered with the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, a militant group fighting for the Palestinian cause through armed struggle. He trained at a PFLP camp near Amman, Jordan, and later at a specialized facility near the Syria-Iraq border. It was during this period that a PFLP recruiting officer gave him the code name that would follow him for the rest of his life, Carlos, a nod to his South American origins. The nickname the Jackal came later and almost by accident. A journalist found a copy of Frederick Forsyth's novel The Day of the Jackal, about a fictional assassin, sitting in one of his London safe houses. The press ran with it. The name stuck permanently. Chapter 2. The first blood. Carlos's operations began with attempted assassinations and grenade attacks across Europe in the early 1970s, working as part of a wider PFLP campaign against Israeli and Western targets. But it was in June 1975 that his life, and the manhunt that would define it, truly began. French police, investigating him in connection with earlier attacks, brought him in for questioning at a Paris apartment. Carlos had concealed a gun. When an informant was brought in to identify him, Carlos drew the weapon and opened fire, killing 2 French police officers and the informant himself, before escaping into the streets. It triggered one of the largest manhunts in French history, a search that would eventually spread across international borders and consume 2 decades of intelligence work. Carlos fled to Beirut. The French government, humiliated, wanted him more badly than almost any fugitive in the country's modern history. He wouldn't be caught for another 19 years. Chapter 3. The OPEC raid. 6 months after the Paris shootout, Carlos carried out the operation that made him globally infamous. In December 1975, he led an armed team into the headquarters of OPEC, the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries, in Vienna, Austria. More than 60 hostages were taken, including the oil ministers of several nations attending a high-level meeting. 3 people were killed in the initial takeover. Carlos negotiated a plane, and the group flew out with their hostages, eventually releasing them across multiple stops in exchange for enormous sums of money. Reported estimates ranged as high as tens of millions of dollars. Carlos escaped entirely, vanishing into a shadow network of sympathetic governments and intelligence services that were willing to look the other way or actively assist him in exchange for his usefulness to their own political interests. He had just demonstrated on live international television that he could strike one of the most secure gatherings of world leaders and simply walk away. Chapter 4. The protected man. For the rest of the 1970s and into the 1980s, Carlos operated less like a hunted fugitive and more like a freelance operator with state-level protection. He was reportedly supported at various points by intelligence services including East Germany's Stasi and the Soviet KGB, who saw value in his ongoing campaign against Western targets. He carried out bombing campaigns in France in the early 1980s, including a series of attacks that killed 11 people and injured more than 100, after his wife, Magdalena Kopp, was arrested and imprisoned by French authorities. The bombings were, by his own admission, an attempt to force her release. France refused to negotiate. Kopp served her sentence regardless. Carlos, meanwhile, continued to move between sympathetic host countries, Hungary, Syria, Libya, and elsewhere, always one step ahead of the governments that wanted him. By the late 1980s, with the Cold War winding down and his usefulness to his former patrons fading, Carlos found himself increasingly isolated. He spent much of that decade effectively living in enforced retirement in Syria, kept largely inactive by hosts who no longer wanted the diplomatic complications he brought with him. Chapter 5. The hunt resumes in 1990. Western intelligence agencies picked the case back up with new urgency, following rumors that Iraq's Saddam Hussein was attempting to recruit Carlos for a renewed terror campaign against American and European targets. The hunt for a man many had assumed would simply fade into irrelevance suddenly became a serious international priority again. Carlos eventually made his way to Khartoum, Sudan, granted asylum under the protection of Hassan al-Turabi, an influential Sudanese political and religious leader. In 1993, an American intelligence contractor was assigned to locate him specifically. Over roughly 4 months, his team identified and surveilled a man working as Carlos's bodyguard, eventually tracing him back to an apartment in Khartoum in February 1994. From an observation post in an abandoned building across the street, they watched Carlos for months, gathering the intelligence that would ultimately be handed over to French agencies. France, in turn, offered Sudan something it badly wanted: improved diplomatic standing and material support, in exchange for cooperation. Sudanese officials, reportedly unimpressed by footage of Carlos's drinking and lifestyle at odds with their own values, quietly agreed not to interfere. Chapter 6. The capture in August 1994. Sudanese authorities lured Carlos out of a hospital where he was recovering from minor surgery and into a nearby apartment. It was there, in the early hours of August 14th, that a team of men entered the apartment and pinned him to his bed while he slept. There was no extradition treaty between France and Sudan, so French agents reportedly sedated Carlos and moved him directly onto a waiting jet. Within hours, one of the most protected fugitives in modern history was airborne, on his way back to the country that had been hunting him for 19 years. He landed in France still largely unaware of the full scale of what had just happened to him. Closing Carlos stood trial in France in 1997 for the 1975 killings of the 2 police officers and the informant who had died in that Paris apartment. He was convicted and sentenced to life in prison. It was only the beginning of his legal reckoning. In 2011, he was tried and convicted again for the bombing campaign that had killed 11 people and injured over 100 in the early 1980s, receiving an additional life sentence. A third life sentence followed in 2017, related to further attacks from that same era. The man, once protected by intelligence services on multiple continents, once able to walk freely through the capitals of nations willing to shelter him, has now spent decades inside a French prison, still serving those consecutive life sentences today. What finally ended his run wasn't a single dramatic confrontation. It was patience. Months of quiet surveillance from an abandoned building, a diplomatic trade between governments, and the simple, unglamorous fact that even the most protected fugitive eventually runs out of countries willing to keep protecting him. The ghost, in the end, was found asleep in his own bed. Every story leaves a trace. This has been traced.